Good evening and welcome to the final part of our series with Dr. Tony Martin, author of Race First, The Ideological and Organizational Struggles of Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. We begin this segment by asking Dr. Martin about some of the groups and individuals who were opposed to Garvey and his ideas.
There was a whole variety of people who were very, very hostile to Garvey. And the very interesting thing is that many of these groups of people were hostile to each other as well. But somehow Garvey antagonized a whole bunch of people. And the reason, I think, largely is ideological. Garvey was a black nationalist. He was for self-reliance. He was for separatism. He was for building a strong black nation, even within the confines of this country. And he was opposed by people, first of all, who were integrationists. People in major organizations like the Urban League and the NAACP, especially the NAACP, because Garvey's success, in a way, showed up these other organizations. Here was Garvey appearing on the scene, refusing to take money from white philanthropists, yet amassing tremendous amounts of money, building institutions. And I might mention here in passing that people sometimes accuse Garvey of wanting to go to Africa at the expense of the struggle here. But the interesting thing is that despite Garvey's concern for Africa, he still did more here, right here in the States, than any of those integrationist organizations which were attacking him. You know, the NAACP at that time didn't build a newspaper as big as Garvey's. Garvey was employing 1,000 people in Harlem. The NAACP wasn't employing anything near that. Garvey had many more followers than the NAACP. So even with the Africa thing, he was still building right here in the Harlems of this country, you know, more than the integrationists. And so a lot of it had to do with ideology. They thought that Garvey's approach was wrong. They wanted to be more part of the American mainstream. They also were upset at Garvey's style. Garvey appealed to the mass of people. They considered Garvey too flamboyant. You know, Garvey wore robes on ceremonial occasions. But they themselves, the integrationists themselves, wore robes and stuff, you know, for their Elks parades and what have you, and you know, and for their marching bands and what have you. But when Garvey did it, for some reason, it didn't seem the same. I don't know why, but they almost had a kind of a double standard in dealing with Garvey. Du Bois was perhaps the major opponent of Garvey. That's W.E. Du Bois, the famous Afro-American historian and sociologist and civil rights leader and all kinds of other things. At the time, Du Bois was editor of The Crisis, which was the official magazine of the NAACP. And he was also director of publicity and research for the NAACP. And The Crisis gave him a powerful sort of a platform. The Crisis at that time, up to 1920, was, you know, a very powerful magazine. It came out once a month. Its circulation peaked around about 1920 at 100,000 copies a month. Garvey's newspaper peaked in the early 20s at a circulation of about 200,000 a week. So Du Bois led the onslaught against Garvey. So it was that mixture of ideology and, you know, jealousy for financial reasons, and there were other things mixed up in it also. Now the communist movement, the Communist International, they also were highly hostile to Marcus Garvey. The Communist Party of the USA was founded in 1919, right around the same time that Garvey was really taking off. 1919 was the year that Garvey started the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation. And communists, naturally, you know, their whole thing was organizing the working class and the peasantry. And these were the people who were in Garvey's movement. And there was no way that the Communist Party could get at the black masses without dealing with Garvey. And so they saw Garvey as an obstacle in their path, you know, to getting to the black masses. And they tried all kinds of things. They tried to get friendly with Garvey. They tried to attack him. They tried to infiltrate his movement, but nothing worked. Garvey didn't have a sort of a right-wing type anti-communist, you know, thing, but he was very, very strong on one point, namely that black people should control their own organizations. So Garvey didn't care if you were coming from the left or the right. He wasn't going to let you take over his organization, which is what the communists tried to do. They tried so hard to do that.
Okay, why were Du Bois and Garvey such fierce opponents?
I have all kinds of theories about this, and my ideas on this have, you know, caused a certain amount of friction. Because Du Bois is a kind of a sacred figure in black history these days, and people don't like to hear criticisms of Du Bois. Even though in his own time, Du Bois was one of the most criticized black leaders, and this is so strange. I mean, not only Garvey, but other leaders. A. Philip Randolph called Du Bois in 1919 a good Negro, meaning an Uncle Tom. You know, they called him an old, you know, washed out, has-been, old crowd Negro. They called him all kinds of things. I think they called him a hat-in-hand Negro and all. But nowadays, though, Du Bois has become a semi-sacred figure, and people don't like to hear criticisms. Now, I acknowledge Du Bois' greatness. I have no problem with his greatness. But in his dealings with Garvey, I think that he was somewhat, you know, unnecessarily negative.
There's a lot of mudslinging going on, right?
Yes, Du Bois went so far as to interject racial kinds of epithets, even though he was a black person himself. He called Garvey, you know, a black, ugly person, for example. This is Du Bois. He said Garvey was uneducated, uncivilized. He said all kinds of strange things about Marcus Garvey. But Du Bois, I believe, tended to be very jealous of any other leader who seemed to be, you know, challenging him for the position of major race leader. Because even before Garvey came on the scene, Du Bois had had a long-standing conflict with Booker T. Washington. He had had a long-standing conflict with William Monroe Trotter, another major leader of that period. So he was always fighting somebody. And whoever happened to be the major leader at the time always seems to have ended up having some problem with Du Bois.
But Garvey was also fighting back, wasn't he?
Garvey fought back, yes, very effectively. Garvey, for example, when Du Bois called Garvey black and ugly, Garvey ran a big headline in his newspaper, you know. Du Bois calls Garvey black and ugly, using white standard of beauty, kind of a thing, you know. Garvey said that Du Bois was ashamed of his race. Garvey said that Du Bois was always harping on the fact that he was part French and part Dutch and part everything else. Garvey called him a monstrosity for being part everything and all of nothing. So you had a lot of mudslinging, you know, going on back and forth. But at basis, it was really an ideological struggle between black nationalism and integrationism. And may I say that this struggle was repeated in the 60s, you know, when you had people like Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin on one side, the integrationists, and people like Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad on the other side, the nationalists.
Marcus Garvey brought attention to the skin game in this country. What about that?
Okay. Now, this is something which, for many years, I think black folk in this country have been very reluctant to confront, and for good reason. It's a kind of an embarrassing thing, the fact that even within the black race, there may be some friction between light and dark. Now, Garvey, coming from the outside, perhaps he was a little less hesitant than the others. The others certainly talked about it, but in more hushed tones. Many of the Afro-America's important novels written from the 19th century deal with this topic. One of the major genres in Afro-American writing for many years was the so-called tragic mulatto, who didn't know which race to identify with, you know. So Garvey certainly didn't introduce that friction, as people have argued. What Garvey did was to rip away the veil of hypocrisy and secrecy that surrounded it, and to bring it up front. Now, Garvey, a few months or so after he arrived in this country, at which time he was still an admirer of Du Bois, because Garvey had read Du Bois's books before coming to this country, and he admired the man. But the first thing that began to turn Garvey off was that when he went to the NAACP office in downtown New York City, and Garvey wrote afterwards that when he went to the office, he couldn't tell whether he was in a black vaudeville or a white sideshow. In other words, there was nobody identifiably black in the NAACP office. The NAACP, as you know, was founded by white people. Du Bois, in the beginning, was the only black member of the NAACP's national executive. The NAACP never even had a black chairman up until the current chairman who assumed office, you know, a few years ago in the 1970s. So that's the first thing that kind of made Garvey sit up and take notice. And as he began to travel around this country, he began to notice that when he went to the better black restaurants, he wrote that the waitresses were always very light-skinned. He discovered in this country two societies. One of them was known as the Blue Vein Society. And this was made up, believe it or not, of black people who were very light complexioned. And to get into this society, you literally had to be able to see, your veins had to look blue. In other words, if you were very dark, your veins, the blue couldn't show up. But if you were very light-skinned, you would have blue veins. And they actually named themselves the Blue Vein Society. There was another group of light-skinned West Indians in this country who called themselves the Colonial Club. They were like the West Indian equivalent of the Afro-American Blue Vein Society. Garvey wrote that he went to a church one day in Detroit, a Blue Vein church. He had heard about this church, and he deliberately went to see if what he heard was true. Because apparently in this church, the dark-skinned brothers and sisters weren't supposed to sit up in front. And Garvey went there one Sunday morning and sat right up in front, and he says that when the preacher, and this preacher was a man called Reverend Bagnall, who later became a high official in the NAACP nationally. But when Reverend Bagnall was ascending the pulpit, Garvey said, when he saw this black face up in the front of his church, he became very belligerent and almost wanted to have a fight with Garvey right there in the church. So that is how serious the situation was. And Garvey was totally opposed to that type of situation. He was not opposed to light-skinned people per se. There were light-skinned people in his movement. He was against those who thought that light skin carried with it privilege.
Okay. Was Garvey obsessed with color?
I wouldn't say that Garvey was obsessed with color. I would say that he was obsessed with justice for black people. And if that kind of obsession meant having to deal with other black people who thought that being light, created privilege, that he was willing to carry the fight even to that level. But beyond that, I wouldn't say that he was obsessed with color. I don't think so.
He could be very hard on black people at times.
Yes. Garvey was one of the harshest critics of black people. It's amazing. But the way I see it is that Garvey earned the right to criticize black people. It's like if, say, your parents would come and tell you, look, man, you're nothing but a lazy, no good person. You might take it from your parents because you know that they're really trying to help you. But you wouldn't take it from somebody outside, coming to tell you you were a lazy, no good person. And up to this day, if you listen very carefully to the rhetoric of many, black leaders, even in the 60s, people like Malcolm X, I think they had that ability to be harsh. I've listened to speeches by Malcolm X, and you hear Malcolm X telling black folk, you're nothing but a bunch of, gut eaters, eating all this pig and what have you, and the white man can do this to you and do that to you, and he asks you to jump and you say how high and what have you. But you have to earn that right to criticize black folk. Everybody can't do it. That is a kind of criticism, though harsh, which is nevertheless based on love for one's people. It's a criticism which wants to uplift.
Talk, if you will, about Garvey's dealings with the Ku Klux Klan.
This is one of the most difficult of all of Garvey's exploits to explain. Now, it happened this way. Now, Garvey was traveling in 1922 around the country. He was in the West, he started in the Pacific Northwest. He worked his way down through California, he came through Oklahoma. And somewhere along, while he was in the South, he came through Louisiana after Oklahoma. He received a message from the Ku Klux Klan, which was headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, that the head of the Klan would like to meet with him. Now, Garvey had for a very long time argued that the Ku Klux Klan was in fact the invisible government of America. He argued that most white Americans, whatever they said in public, deep down in their heart of hearts, they identified at some level with the Ku Klux Klan. Also, there was a history of conflict in the South between the Ku Klux Klan and the Garvey movement, the UNIA. There were cases when there were, clashes, physical clashes between them. There was a case, I think it was in Texas, where a UNIA organizer had been, physically assaulted by Klan members. There was a case where some UNIA members had assaulted, some young men from the Klan in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, when they had found these young men, harassing black women and so on. So there was this kind of real conflict between the two organizations in the South. Now, Garvey kind of figured that, well, look, the Klan seems to be the most powerful white organization in the South. The UNIA is clearly the most powerful black organization in Afro-America. So Garvey saw the meeting with the Klan as a sort of a summit meeting, the way that President Nixon went to China, let us say, or other American presidents went to Russia. He saw it at strictly that level. Now they met, both sides outlined where they were coming from, and Garvey was able to tell the Klan that, that the UNIA was a nationalist organization. They weren't for interracial, marriage and that kind of thing. So that this may have made the Klan realize that, since that was their major hang-up, that as far as, racial mixture was concerned, they had nothing to worry about from the UNIA. And apparently the two groups were able to work out some kind of a modus vivendi whereby they would, coexist without having to be, fighting, back and forth all the time. And that seems to be what happened. Now, Garvey wrote a report of that meeting, and Garvey expressed it, in a very, very colorful fashion. He said, the Klan, the leader of the Klan was talking to me as a man who was brutally a white man, and I was talking to him as a man who was brutally a black man. So, Garvey was coming from a strong black perspective. He realized their strong white perspective, and all that they were trying to do was to work out some arrangement whereby they wouldn't be...
Coexist.
Right, to coexist, that's all. However, for very understandable reasons, the Klan had such a history of oppressing black people in the society that nothing Garvey said could get around some of the propaganda that his enemies put out. His integrationist enemies seized upon this meeting with the Klan, and they began putting out the most incredible propaganda. They put out articles saying that Garvey had joined the Klan, that he was now a spokesman for the Klan, totally off the wall and incredible statements. But nevertheless, because of the role the Klan has played in Afro-American society, history, I think that tactically it may have been a mistake on Garvey's part, even though ideologically I see where he was coming from, and I have no problem with where he was coming from. That's basically the story.
Okay. How would you describe Marcus Garvey, the religious man?
Now, religion for Garvey played a very, very important part in his life and in his movement, especially. I mentioned earlier that one of Garvey's main ideas was race first, putting one's racial self-interest first. And Garvey very, very skillfully injected race first into religion. Now, Garvey knew that religion played a very important role in the lives of black people. And unlike some other leaders who have tried to attack religion, Garvey decided instead to try and use it. He first of all redefined, the whole gospel and Jesus Christ thing. Garvey saw Jesus Christ as somebody who came to lead oppressed people in his time. Garvey saw Jesus Christ as a revolutionary leader. And that's the connection he made. He reinterpreted many of the Christian ceremonies and doctrines and festivals. For example, at Christmas time, he would give a lecture on the rebirth of the Negro. The word Negro being used in those days,
For
yes.
Easter.
Yeah. For Easter too, he would talk about the resurrection of the Negro and so on, so that he was able to use Christian symbolism. Now, all UNIA branches had a chaplain, and there's a lot of religious symbolism around the movement. The UNIA still exists up to today. It's not as powerful as it used to be, but it still exists, and I've been to many UNIA meetings, and up to today, the meeting is organized to some extent like a kind of a semi-religious, church service. They sing hymns. In Garvey's day, the meeting would begin with a procession. Garvey would be in his robes, and the various uniformed and other auxiliaries of the movement would have a procession. At the end of the meeting, there would be a recessional hymn, and they would, march down from the platform and what have you. But it was very much like a Christian type ceremony. Many of the hymns they sang were in fact Christian hymns, even though Garvey did not actually support any one specific denomination, but the symbolism was largely Christian.
He had problem with one of the popes, didn't he? I think I read that he had a problem with this pope that gave blessing to the Italians when they were on their way to Ethiopia.
Yes, he criticized the pope for that. He did. He was always, having conflicts with with, the more conservative elements, among the Christian denominations. But on the other hand, a lot of the more radical churchmen followed him. A lot of preachers were in his movement. Some of the leaders of his movement were preachers. Many preachers threw open their churches to him for his lectures and so on. So he had a lot of support from churches and a lot of criticism, too, from churches, both.
Some NAACP members, according to your book, also didn't have any problem with dealing with Marcus Garvey and the NAACP.
Yes, there were one or two rank and file members. The leadership, of course, would have been different.
Right.
But at the level of rank and file, you did have some people who belonged to both organizations. There was one woman I remember who I quoted in there. I think at one point she belonged to the Garvey's UNIA, to the NAACP, and also to the National Equal Rights League, led by William Monroe Trotter from Boston. But this particular lady, though, became very upset at one point, and I think she actually left the NAACP after a while.
What impact did Marcus Garvey have on the Harlem Renaissance?
Garvey had a very great impact on the Renaissance, and one which is not very well known. In fact, one of my most recent books deals with this topic. I call it Literary Garveyism, and the subtitle is Garvey, Black Arts, and the Harlem Renaissance. Now, the Harlem Renaissance, is one of the most important periods in the history of Afro-American literature. It was a period of the flowering of black literature, and many of the big names in our literary history come out of that period. And that period, to some extent, coincided with Garvey's period in the 1920s and 30s. People like Langston Hughes, people like Zora Neale Hurston, people like Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Jean Toomer, all of these very, very big names in our literary tradition come out of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, what I argue is that Garvey had a parallel Renaissance. He had his own Harlem Renaissance, which at times intersected with the main Renaissance, the mainstream Renaissance, but which was very different nevertheless. The mainstream Renaissance, I argue, was a Renaissance that was to a large extent controlled by white people. You had a situation where there were black writers and poets and artists and what have you who were kept by rich white people who were their mentors. Langston Hughes was financed by white mentors. Zora Neale Hurston was. Claude McKay was. Most of your major figures, were controlled by white moneyed people. And this affected what they wrote, not so much in terms of the stylistic content, but in terms of the ideological content. For example, the white publishers had a stereotyped picture of black people as licentious, sexually, profligate and what have you. And they asked the black writers to write books that reflected this. In other words, what they were trying to do was to play to the stereotypes that white people had about black people. Now, Garvey's Renaissance was very different. It was more uplifting, and it was much closer. In fact, it was practically the same as what in the 1960s came to be known as the Black Arts Movement. In the 1960s, when you had people like Larry Neal and Imamu Baraka and poets like Sonia Sanchez and so on, they came up with a new black literature, and they defined something they called the black aesthetic. And by the black aesthetic, they meant that black writers and other artists had to play a positive role. It wasn't enough to simply be a good writer. One had to write in such a way as to uplift one's people, to help one struggle forward. And this is precisely what Garvey was saying back in the 1920s.
Okay, let's get back to Garvey and the NAACP, if we could, for a minute, and the government's effort to deport him. What role, once again, did the NAACP play in this regard? Now, Du Bois, the major NAACP spokesman, there were times when he actually wrote people like the Secretary of State and complained about Garvey. Now, in 1924, when the Liberian president, Liberia in West Africa, when the president of that country was inaugurated, Du Bois was sent by the US government as a minister extraordinary and a plenipotentiary, that is, as a special diplomatic representative. And Lord knows what he must have told the Liberians, because Garvey at that time was in the process of trying to establish a foothold in Liberia. And after Du Bois went there, the Liberians changed their minds and very rudely, upset Garvey's plans. And around that time, Du Bois wrote the Secretary of State, and he said that, look, man, Garvey is, a
criminal, you know, and you want to watch him carefully and so on. In 1922, in January of 1922, 8 of the major integrationist leaders in this country, including a couple from the NAACP, wrote an incredible letter to the Attorney General of the US of A, a man called Harry Doherty, and told him in that letter that Marcus Garvey was a criminal, that he was stirring up racial hatred, that his followers consisted of the most criminal elements of Afro-Americans and West Indians, that he was violent, that he should be put in jail as quickly as possible, and if possible, deported. They wrote this letter around the same time that Garvey was indicted for alleged mail fraud. And their whole idea was to prejudice the case against Garvey. The Attorney General is the highest legal authority in the country on a political basis. And they were actually trying to influence him. And he did encourage them, and he went along with them. So that's the kind of thing that the NAACP was involved in. Garvey's trial eventually took place in 1923. And for about a year or so before the trial, a group of NAACP and other integrationist people went around the country organizing something they called the Marcus Garvey Must Go campaign. And that was the message: Marcus Garvey must go, meaning he must go to jail and he must leave the country. So they had a direct and awful hand in his
What eventually happened in that mail fraud case?
The government alleged that Garvey had sent or caused to be sent certain circulars through the mails which promised dividends would be paid in Garvey's Black Star Line Company. Now, Garvey argued that there was no fraudulent intent. You know, all corporations send circulars out and promise dividends. Companies fail every day in this country. But the fact that a company is unable to pay dividends is, you know, in itself no evidence of fraud. But the case was totally a political case. They were looking for some way to get Garvey off the scene, and that's the way they decided to do it. And mail fraud and conspiracy are the two charges that traditionally have always been used against people who there was nothing concrete to pin on, but who the government wanted to have out of the way anyway.